So I'm not going to talk much about this little book pour une révolution fiscale. I will say a few words maybe at some point, and I will also come back to the sort of practical policy debate that was addressed by Steve in his presentation of the Merce list review conclusion. But basically, most of my talk is going to be more, in a way, more theoretical, in the sense that I'm going to be concerned about optimal taxation. And I'm going to try to make progress and try to think about what would be, the optimal system if we could really design it as we want. Say we have maybe not a world government, but a European Union government, trying to compute the optimal balance between labor and capital taxation. What will be the optimal balance? And I think it's important at some point to go back to this, social welfare maximization perspective, because it's a complicated issue. You will certainly not go for 100% capital tax. How far would you go? Should you tax more? Should you tax more capital than labor? Well, it depends. I will argue. Sometimes you may want less, but sometimes you may want more. This is an issue on which we know very little, as I said in this quote that Steve took during his presentation. And I want to make progress on this deep intellectual issue. Then, of course, there are also practical considerations, which is that each country taken individually is a small country, cannot implement the world social optimum on its own. And so, practical policy advice is a slightly different issue, which I'm also trying to address in some other, publications of mine. But let's say that this is a more sort of intellectual and theoretical reflection on capital taxation, which I think ideas are important, and I think we need to make progress on the intellectual side as well, and we cannot just take a purely pragmatic perspective on this important intellectual issue of capital taxation. So, I think that's very much needed, because if we take a broad overview on optimal tax theory and what have we learned in optimal tax theory over the past decades. Of course, I'm being unfair to the many important contributions that have been made. But if I want to make a brief summary, I will say, we have made some progress regarding the optimal taxation of labor income, but we have made almost no progress about, the optimal taxation of capital. And basically, we have lots of theory saying that we should have, 0% capital tax. Well, that's fine, except that, 0% is really very small, and when you have a theory that's making prescriptions that are so far away as compared to the real world, of course, you can conclude that the real world is not optimal, it's not rational, but you can also conclude that maybe the theory is just out of the picture, and I think we need really to make progress on the theory in order to have just a useful theory, which I think my own judgment is that, the current state of optimal tax theory, is close to zero. What we know is very little. So here I will present some new theoretical results which are extracted from ongoing work with my colleague and friend Emmanuel Saez. We certainly do not pretend that we have a perfect theory, but I think we are making progress, and we start from so low, that I think this is useful progress. That's the good thing I like actually about economics as a discipline, is that generally speaking, we start from very low, so we can make progress, and that's why I was attracted in this field to start with. And I think I'm making slow progress, but again, the marginal product to progress is important in this area. Okay, so let me summarize what I view as a useful theory of optimal taxation. I view as useful a theory that is both, grounded on principles, where we really look at the true social optimum, but also where we can use the theory to put numbers. So I like optimal tax formulas that can be used to put numbers so that we can say something about the real world. And optimal taxation of labor income, I think, has made progress, because we do have optimal tax formulas that can be used with numbers. So let me remind you the basic formula. We take very simple one-period model of optimal labor income taxation. So pre-tax labor income Y is equal to the product of productivity times number of hours of work, or it could be effort. It's not only hours of work, it's also the intensity of work. Disposable income consumption, it's only one period model, so very simple, is just y minus t of y, which is a tax on labor income. Okay? Now, you have a very simple optimal tax formula, which is that t prime divided by 1 minus t prime, where t prime is the marginal tax rate, is the product of two effects, which is simply an elasticity effect and a distribution effect. Okay? So the elasticity effect, so E is the elasticity of labor supply. This is just the standard inverse elasticity rule, which is that, this is the basic lesson of optimal tax theory. Don't tax too much what's elastic. So if you have a high elasticity of labor supply, you want a low marginal rate. If when you tax something at higher rates, it escapes, you should not tax it too much. That's a, very simple lesson. It's not very deep, but, economics is about very simple ideas. And the second effect now is more interesting in a way. This is a pure distribution effect. So this is the ratio between 1 minus capital F divided by y small f. So little f is the density function for the distribution of income, whereas capital F is a distribution function. So basically, this is the ratio between the fraction of the population that's above income Y and the density of the distribution at the level of Y. So why is it that other things equal, you want a higher marginal rate when this ratio is higher? Well, because, the density measures how many people are going to be affected negatively by the incentive effect, whereas 1 minus capital F measures how many people are going to pay more tax as a consequence of increasing the marginal rate. So it's really the ratio of the two that determines the equity efficiency trade-off. Very simple, but very, very nice, because this formula can be used to put numbers and to think about real-world tax policy trade-offs in an informed way, or at least in a more informed way than if we have no theory. So this is a very minimalist definition of what a useful theory is, which is that we want to be able to use the tax formula to talk about real-world tax rate, in a bit more clever way than without the theory. So just to give you two examples of application, very quickly, if the elasticity effect is flat, so if you have the same elasticity all over the distribution, then this is implying that the marginal tax rate should follow a U-shaped pattern with lower rates in the middle and higher rates both at the bottom and at the top. Okay? It's not because you like the middle class more. It's just for pure efficiency reason, which is because the middle class is where you have the higher density of population. If the elasticity is the same everywhere, then you don't want to have too high marginal rate in this area, and you'd better have the high marginal rate both at the bottom and at the top. Now, of course, the elasticity effect itself might counterbalance this distribution effect. Okay. This is all very well-known stuff now, but I'm just summarizing the idea just so that you get a sense of what I like in a theory of optimal taxation, where you have simple but robust effects which can then be used with real numbers. So, for instance, the second part of the story. Well, maybe just one more word about the first part, the first application. If the elasticity is higher at the bottom, of course, if the elasticity does not follow a flat pattern, but if you have higher elasticity at the bottom of the distribution, typically because you have extensive participation effect at the bottom, then, of course, this might counterbalance the argument in favor of high marginal rate at the bottom, and you might actually want to have work credit, tax credit at the bottom, like the earned income tax credit in the US, the work tax credit in the UK, the prime pour l'emploi the RSA in France. So different ways to reduce the marginal rate of taxation on low-wage work. And you can study, using this tax formula, you can study the trade-off and the equity efficiency trade-off related to this kind of policy. And this is used extensively in the Merlis review part, which Steve did not present, on the part of optimal taxation of labor income. And this is clearly an example where, theory and empirical application go hand in hand. And I think it's an example where economists are sort of useful, which is not that common, unfortunately. And just a second example of the theoretical application is that the asymptotic marginal rate, if you just apply the previous formula, in fact, the second term, the distribution effect, given that the distribution of income at the top looks like a Pareto distribution, in fact, you can show that the asymptotic formula looks like this, which is that the marginal rate T prime converges toward a very, very simple formula. Now, in principle, where A is the Pareto coefficient. Okay, so the Pareto coefficient measures, in effect, this is the Pareto formula is that the density is y at the power 1 plus a, where a is the Pareto coefficient. So when you have a bigger Pareto coefficient, this means that the density is converging towards 0 at a faster pace. Okay, so the density is always, of course, converging towards 0. When you go very up in the distribution, you have fewer people. The question is, at what speed is this converging towards 0? Now, in the US, since the 70s, with the rise of inequality, typically, the Pareto coefficient has been declining a lot. Okay, has been going down from 2.5 to 1.5. Okay, which means that you have a fatter upper tail. Okay, which means that this is converging towards 0, but at a much lower rate than it used to be. So to put it bluntly, there are a lot more people out there at the top of the distribution, so there's a lot more money to get there. And so then the conclusion of optimal tax theory is that we should have a higher tax rate at the top, which of course is exactly the opposite of what we had in the real world. And I think this has a lot to do with political capture by the elite and all sorts of perverse political effects, which in a way Pierre was alluding to. But in any case, maybe that's my first, the first problem maybe I have with the Merlis review approach is that taking as given the degree of progressivity, in a world where income inequality has increased a lot, is very strange from a social welfare maximization perspective, because every piece of theory we have tells us the opposite, which is that again, when income concentration increase, we should prescribe as economists an increase in tax progressivity. So I find it really strange to take as given this as a constraint. Maybe it's a sort of UK one country perspective and very pragmatic perspective and social welfare, but I think as academics sometimes it's good to have a sort of broader perspective and social welfare maximization. In any case, at least the theory is useful to get at these facts. Maybe the main limitation of this theory of optimal labor income taxation is that at the very top, I think the elasticity in the real world has really little to do with labor supply effect. It has a lot to do with tax enforcement issues. It has a lot to do with rent extraction, marginal product illusion. I think we should be very careful about the marginal product illusion. In our model, in our optimal tax model, we always assume that individual labor income is equal to marginal product. So in effect, this means that we are assuming that when someone in a large corporation is getting 1 million euros in extra pay, this must be that his marginal product to the production of the company has increased by 1 million. Well, maybe it's a bit naive to view the world this way. And, maybe sometimes it has more to do with the bargaining model and the marginal product model is maybe not very suitable for the top end of the labor market process. So I think this is one of the key limitations. But, at least, at least we have tax formulas which are, which can be used to make recommendations about top rate, which are not completely out of line with the real world. At least this allows us to think about the real world in a more informed way. Now, this is not the case with optimal capital taxation, because here, what our standard theoretical model tells us, the very most standard theory is that the optimal tax rate on capital should be equal to 0%. And, the problem is simply that 0% again is really very, very small. And if we were to take this seriously, this would imply that we should be pushing for the complete suppression of corporate tax, inheritance tax, property tax. Everybody in principle should favor a 0% optimal tax rate on capital, including those agents and dynasties who own zero capital. Okay? So even those who own no capital at all, for instance, should prefer a poll tax where everybody pays the same lump sum amount rather than a property tax. Because according to our standard model, even a 1% or 0.1% or 0.01% property tax should lead in the long run to distortions which are so large that everybody, including the dynasties with zero wealth at all, will be better off by paying a poll tax every year. So, it's really a bit crazy when you think about it, because, I have no problem with an incentive argument saying that when the elasticity is larger, you should tax less. But here, you don't even have the choice. You don't make any assumption about the elasticity. The theory tells you that it has to go down to 0%. There must be something wrong with the theory. If you don't even need to make an assumption about the relevant elasticity and you get such an extreme conclusion, it must be that you have some problem with the model. And I think this is bad, because this means that in particular we have no useful theory, to think about the large existing capital tax which we see in the real world. Again, I'm just taking Eurostat data for 2010. The average tax rate in the European Union, if you take the 27 countries, and you weight by GDP, is 39%, so almost 40% of GDP in tax, while you have almost 10% in capital tax, excluding self-employment income tax. Okay, that's only property tax, corporate income tax, interest income, dividend tax, wealth tax. So it's a combination of tax. Inheritance tax per se is typically less than 1% of GDP. Corporate tax is going to be 2 or 3%, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less. Property tax is going to be 2%. Well, anyway, when you sum up everything, you get this. It's a lot of tax revenue. If we wanted to put that to 0%, you would have to increase labor income tax or consumption tax by a lot. And I think, nobody is seriously pushing for that. So, we can take a pragmatic perspective with a normal rate of return and extra tax on higher rates of return, but I think this is a bit too pragmatic, in a way. I think we want to have a deeper theory to think about that, and that's what we are getting at. So basically, there's going to be two ingredients in the theory. The first is going to be inheritance, which is going to play a very important role in the theory. I think inheritance plays an important role not only to understand the theory of taxation of inheritance, but also to the taxation of capital income. And the second ingredient to go from inheritance tax to lifetime tax is going to be imperfect capital markets. And the link between the two is very simple, which is if with perfect capital market, maybe you would like to have only a big tax on inheritance, and then let people, do what they want with their wealth and capital income. So in principle, everybody should prefer, paying a big tax on inheritance and say zero property tax forever. Now, in the real world, you can see that it doesn't work like this. You can see that people prefer, for instance, to pay a 1% property tax during 30 years rather than paying a 30% tax on inheritance right away. Why is it so? Is it because of tax illusion? Well, we will argue that this is because of capital market imperfections. The very simple reason why they prefer to spread the tax burden over their entire lifetime rather than paying everything at the time of inheritance. So that's going to be the second key ingredient. Now, these two ingredients are important. And let me emphasize that if we had no inheritance, so if wealth was entirely due to life cycle, accumulation. And if we had perfect capital markets, then we believe that the case for 0% capital tax will indeed be very strong. And basically, for the standard reason is that with perfect capital markets, basically you can really think of 1 plus R, where R is the rate of return, as a relative price for present consumption. And then the argument that we should not distort this, intertemporal consumption decision would indeed be a very strong argument. But when you have inheritance and when you have imperfect capital markets, well, imperfect capital markets alone will be enough to get you that. Inheritance will be enough to get you an inheritance tax, but we need both ingredients in order to have, the kind of tax systems that we have in the real world, where you have both inheritance tax, at least at the very top, and a large lifetime capital income tax. So, in particular, a key parameter in the tax formula I will show you. Maybe, Roger, if you remind me how more time I can use, so that I can organize my... I have, so 30 minutes. Okay, that's good. Okay, so I'm going to show you a theory with simple optimal tax formula for inheritance taxation, and then we'll go from inheritance taxation to capital taxation at large. Now, there's a key parameter that's going to play a very important role in the optimal tax formula, which is what I call BY, which is the ratio between B and Y. And this is the ratio between the aggregate bequest flow, so how much inheritance is transmitted every year in a given society, divided by national income Y. Okay? Now, that's a very important parameter because basically this measures how big is inheritance as compared to income. And that's going to play a very important role, which is that basically, it's not only that there is more to tax when BY is large. Of course, there is more to tax when BY is large. But it's going to be more subtle than that. It's going to be that the level of inheritance is also going to have an impact on the optimal tax rate. And typically, when you have a higher tax rate, you want to tax more inheritance because, in a way, the past wealth is more important as compared to your future wealth accumulation. The complicated thing about inheritance tax is that everybody potentially is both a receiver and a giver. Okay, so everybody as a receiver of inheritance, maybe you want to tax a lot other people if you don't receive anything. But as a giver, you care about your kid. Maybe even if you did not receive anything yourself, you want to transmit to your kids. So there is really a trade-off between the past and the future. And, this is the deep trade-off about capital, which is that this is also a trade-off between entrepreneur and rentier. At some point, past capital becomes, a rent. And so you have this trade-off between the past and the future. And basically, when BY is very large, then wealth coming from the past is very important as compared to the wealth you can transmit to the future. So you will want to tax inheritance a lot. Whereas when it's small, then in effect, you really care about your children. You care about the future and not too much about the rentiers of the past because, as compared to the future, they are not very important. So here I am really using the results from a previous paper of mine on the long-run evolution of inheritance, which is a paper that I'm going to summarize very quickly now, which took me a very long time, basically. It took me, I had been thinking about this issue for almost 10 years, and I could not figure out, why the inheritance flow was changing the way it did in the very long run. And I think now I better understand, basically what we observe in the long run is quite spectacular. So this is the summary of the paper, which is that we have a long run U-shape in the flow of inheritance. Basically, so the observed flow of inheritance is observed in two different ways, and I get similar results. One way is through the tax data. So the good thing in France is that starting with the French Revolution, we have a pretty universal tax on both inheritance and gift. So we can observe pretty well the bequest flow. And in particular, in the 19th century, you can see that inheritance is very big. And it's very big not only in the novels of Balzac or Proust or Jane Austen in the UK, for that matter, but it's also big in tax statistics. It's not only in the imagination of novelists. It's not only because Balzac had a lot of debt and was obsessed with wealth. It's also, it was really big in tax statistics in the sense that if you compare the flow of inheritance to national income, you get about 20-25% as an annual flow, which is really huge because you know, it comes year after year. So basically, if you take the share of cumulated inheritance in the stock of wealth, you get basically that all the wealth comes from inheritance. And if you take the capitalized bequest, it's more than 100% of the wealth, which makes a lot of sense. It's just because you have a lot of people who are consuming the return to the inherited wealth. Now you can see that you have a big change in the following World War I. You have another decline following World War II, and then you have a slow recovery process. And you know, the bottom line, you know, that's a very robust finding, at least for the part until 2010. You know, after 2010, of course, this is a theoretical prediction of the model. Let me summarize the basic ingredients. The basic theory of the model is this. You know, so the basic story is, you know, how does the rate of return R compares to the growth rate? And the basic story is that, you know, why is it that we had such a big flow of inheritance in the 19th century? And why is it that the flow of inheritance is again getting big today? Well, this is because when you have a small growth rate, so think in the 19th century, typically 1%, G equal 1% during 1 century, and a rate of return of just 4 or 5%. Well, over a century, this has tremendous effect, which is that wealth coming from the past is capitalized faster than growth. So basically, people who receive inheritance can consume, you know, if you have R equal 5% and G equal 1%, they can consume 80% of the return to their inheritance and save just 20%, and basically their inheritance will keep growing at the same pace of national income. And if they save more than 20%, then this will increase relatively to national income. So it's really a nice life for rentiers, basically. And whenever you have low growth rate and high return as compared to the growth rate, the same mechanism is starting again. And that's a big part of the reason why we have this recovery, you know, especially in the past 30 years. So in the past 3 decades in a country like France, the average growth rate was 1.7%. This is including population growth. If you take away population growth, it's closer to 1%, 1.2%. So it's, you know, it's a bit better than the 19th century, but basically we are almost back to this. And I think to a large extent, you know, economies at the world technological frontier are bound to grow relatively slowly. Maybe you can do 2% instead of 1%, but you know, we've never seen countries at the world frontier growing at 4 or 5% a year. That just never happens. So if this is distinctly lower than the rate of return, which is, by the way, what you get in every theoretical model of capital accumulation we have, then it's almost unavoidable that the inheritance flow is converging back to this very high level. You know, I don't have time to present you all the formula, but basically, you know, you can explain with a very simple steady-state model of capital accumulation and inheritance where this 20% number comes from. You know, basically it's going to be something like beta divided by H, where beta is the aggregate wealth income ratio, so say 600% or 500%. If you have 6 years of income in aggregate wealth, 5 years of income in aggregate wealth, divided by H, which is the average length of a generation. So if it's 30 years, you have basically 600 divided by 30 equal 20%. And you can prove that this is exactly the steady state value to which you converge when the growth rate goes to 0% for a very large class of saving models. So there are really deep reasons why I think this is what we observe. In any case, you know, a lot is going to depend for the future about the growth rate and the net of tax rate of return. And you can see that here what matters is the net of tax rate of return. So for the post-2010 period, you know, of course, I don't know what the growth rate is going to be. I don't know what the net of tax rate of return is going to be. All I am saying is that, you know, there's very little chance that we ever return to the Modigliani period. You know, Modigliani, of course, was writing his life cycle theory of wealth accumulation in the 50s and 60s. So at that time, you know, in a way, you know, everybody is influenced by the things he see around him when he writes. And my only advantage is that as of 2010, I have more points of data, so I can see that the 50s and 60s was a very strange time period where indeed people did not inherit very much. Because first a lot of wealth had been destroyed by the war, and next the people who were old, it was just too late for them to recover. If you are 60-year-old in 1940 and you get everything bombed or everything destroyed by inflation, it's just too late to accumulate again. Whereas when you are 40 or 50, you have a chance to accumulate a bit more after the war. So the whole age pattern of wealth has also been completely changed by the war, but this was a very unusual time period. Okay? And that's why, the life cycle theory of wealth accumulation, I think maybe, to a large extent was right at that time, for this generation, like the Modigliani generation. But for generation, like myself, who were born in the 70s, or, and even more for those who were born in the 80s or 90s, inheritance is going to matter a lot. And typically, people, say in Paris, who only have their labor income, or in London, if they have zero inheritance, most likely they will not accumulate much wealth, and they will just pay rent typically to the children of those who receive inheritance. And I think this is a challenge for, the sort of our meritocratic view of the world. And this is something that will, it will take us a lot of time to realize, but I think this is the kind of natural evolution we are heading to, especially if we have very little capital tax. And this is why I am a bit concerned with any policy proposal that may cut even further the tax on capital. And this is my second source of disagreement, maybe with the Merlis review, is that the normal rate of return allowance, in principle, will be okay if we set the normal rate of return to 0% or 1% in terms of real return on the top of inflation. If we set it at 5%, which is my understanding what happened in Belgium and in Sweden, then it's like suppressing all form of capital tax, and I think that's very, very bad in the long run. Anyway, coming back to the theory, what's going to be different from the standard Chamley-Judd and Atkinson-Stiglitz argument? So let me do the two in turn. The big difference, in the Chamley-Judd model, you do have inheritance, but the infinite horizon specification of the model has very crazy implication and delivers basically the zero tax result. And there are two dimensions which are very weird. By the way, Christopher Chamley is very much aware of that. As you said, I think Ken Judd is the only one who believes in the zero capital tax result, but I don't think Christopher believes in that, and I don't think, and I know that Atkinson and Stiglitz certainly don't believe in it. There are two problems. Is that first, sometimes the infinite horizon model is used in order to calculate social welfare only from the point of view of the first generation. But of course, from the point of view of the first generation, if you tax capital, then the distortion becomes infinite. If you look at 3 centuries from now. But on the other hand, this is really a crazy way to measure social welfare when each period is a generation. And if you take the opposite extreme, which is that you measure only steady state in the long run, so you look at the long run generation, then the problem is that with the infinite horizon model, in effect, the elasticity of capital supply, E, with respect to the tax rate on inheritance, is infinite. Okay? Which is really weird, because again, I have no problem with positive elasticity. But of course, if you assume an infinite elasticity from the beginning, you're going to get a zero tax rate. But what's the point of you want the elasticity to be a free parameter. You don't want to constrain it to be infinite. Okay, so we want a theory where that's going to be a free parameter. So you need to formulate the dynamic model differently. And of course, you want inheritance because if you don't have inheritance, then clearly you're back to Atkinson-Stiglitz. Okay. Which is that, you don't want to tax second period consumption. Now, here the important intuition maybe is the dimensionality argument that was already given by Pierre. At some level, the ideas we are putting here have already been expressed, but we sort of try to push them further and to get optimal tax formulas that can be used with numbers. The key argument here is a sort of dimensionality argument, which is if the only source of heterogeneity between individuals is labor income, then indeed a labor income tax is going to be enough. You don't need to tax inheritance. But if there is another dimension of inequality, which is inheritance, and if the two dimensions do not perfectly coincide, okay? So you always have people who have high labor income but low inheritance, some people who have low labor income and high inheritance. You know, you have a full support in the two-dimensional diagram with inheritance and labor income. And you have this forever, including in the very long run. Then it's completely obvious that you want an inheritance tax. Because, you know, in a two-dimensional world, you want a two-dimensional tax instrument. You know, it will be stupid just to use one instrument, labor income taxation. And whenever you have a model that tells you that you don't want inheritance tax, that you only want labor income taxation, it must be because somewhere you have a one-dimensional reduction in the dynamic process. That is, it must be that in the very long run, you have a correlation equal to exactly 1 between your rank in the labor income distribution and your rank in the inheritance distribution. In other words, high-income dynasty are exactly the same as high inheritance dynasty. And of course, if that was true in the real world, then it would be enough to tax labor income. But in the real world, again, it's not true. You have lots of people, you know, with high labor income but little wealth, little inherited wealth, and you have the reverse also is true. You know, the correlation, of course, is positive, but it's not 1. It's say 0.6, 0.7. I mean, it's certainly too high, and I would like it to be lower, but it's not 1. So basically what we want is a theory that take into account all these effects, and most of all, which is robust to sort of details in the way we formulate heterogeneity and the way we model the dynamic process. Okay, so let me go through very quickly the simplest equation of the model. Let's take a model where each agent, you know, say one period of the model is going to be one generation, one cohort, and let's say that one period lasts for h years, where h will be something like 30 years, okay, like one generation. In the paper, we have a full continuous time model, but let's take this simplified version of the model. You are born at the beginning of period t. You receive bequest, which we note BTI. So Mr. I received bequest BTI at the beginning of period T. You work during period T. You receive labor income by the end of the period. YLTI is labor income. And then you decide how much to consume and how much to leave as bequest. And let's start with this simple functional form for preferences, and then we extend the result to any preferences. Okay? But let's start with this simple functional form, where you will get a very simple linear transition equation, where basically you leave to the next generation a fixed fraction of your labor income and the capitalized value of your inheritance. Okay, so these are the two dimensions of inequality, labor income and inheritance. Okay, so some people have high labor income, you know, we take some exogenous productivity distribution, and some people have high inheritance, and we also have heterogeneity in the preference parameter. So, you know, there are some people who have a big taste for bequest, or maybe a big taste for wealth accumulation per se. In fact, you know, it's unclear whether people care really about the bequest or about wealth per se. In any case, you know, this is very heterogeneous across individuals. We have a whole distribution of preference parameters, and we have this transition equation. Now, the nice thing with this linear model is that if we make a simple independence assumption, which is that the expectation of the preference parameter is basically orthogonal to the labor income shock and the received inheritance shock, then the transition equation can be aggregated very simply, and we can keep track of the aggregate without caring about the distribution, basically. And then you can see that you have a very simple steady-state formula for the flow of inheritance, which you can then calibrate to get the numbers right as compared to the real world. Okay? So typically, you can see in the formula, so this is the formula for BY, the R minus G effect, which I told you about before, which is that when you have a bigger R minus G factor, then you have a bigger flow of inheritance in steady state, because basically wealth coming from the past is more important. Okay. Now, without adding anything, you can show that in this model, the optimal tax rate on inheritance is going to be given by a very simple formula. So here, to start with, we look at the pure Rawlsian optimum. That is, we look at the optimum from the point of view of those who receive 0 bequest. Okay? So if you want, this is a sort of Rawlsian meritocratic optimum. We don't care about your productivity parameters. We put equal weight to an high productivity individual, low productivity individual, middle productivity, but we put all the weight on those who receive 0 inheritance. And also, we assume that you don't need tax revenue. You have just 2 policy tools. You tax inheritance, and in order to redistribute to labor income. Then you get a very simple formula where basically, if you take with these values, you're going to tax inheritance at 59% in order to subsidize labor income at 17%. Now, the important point in this formula is that, here in fact, there's no elasticity effect. So because we have this Cobb-Douglas form for utility function, in fact, you can see that, whether you tax labor or inheritance is going to be neutral in terms of aggregate capital accumulation. So in fact, you have no elasticity effect in the long run. We will put elasticity back in afterwards, but the important point here is that even without an elasticity effect, then the people, the 0 receivers, as we tell them, they don't want to tax bequest at 100%. Maybe sometimes people say we want to tax bequest at 100%. Well, no, even people who don't receive anything, they don't want to tax bequest at 100% because they themselves want to leave bequest. And so you have a non-degenerate and interesting trade-off between taxing rentiers from your own cohort and not taxing too much your own children. And this is something we like in this theory, is that I think we are able to capture in a very simple way the fact that everybody both is a receiver and a giver, and you have a non-degenerate trade-off coming from there. Now, there are limitations to this formula. So the first important limitation is that we assume there was no public good production and no revenue requirement. Clearly, which in the real world, you don't tax inheritance in order to subsidize labor. You tax both inheritance and labor in order to raise tax revenue. So let's take an exogenous tax revenue requirement. Let's assume that you need to raise 30% of national income in tax revenue. If we take 40%, whatever you want. Okay, so we do like Steve, we take as given a revenue constraint, and we are asking what's the optimal tax structure on labor and inheritance from the point of view of social welfare maximization with this Rawlsian perspective on putting all weight on people with 0 inheritance. And here, I think very interesting finding is that it's actually not obvious whether you want to tax inheritance more than labor or not. Okay. It really depends in the parameters in an interesting way, which is, so if we take the first numerical example, if we have a large inheritance flow of 20%, which was the case in the 19th century and which to some extent is again going to be the case today, then indeed you want a very large tax rate, 73% on inheritance. So it's not 100%, but it's pretty big. And so that you're going to be able to tax labor income only at 22%. So that people who only have their labor income, they will be able to accumulate more to leave something to their own children. Now, if you have a small inheritance flow, then you will actually want to do the opposite. If the inheritance flow is only 5%, which was the case typically for the Modigliani generation, and I think some of today's economists are still thinking in terms of the Modigliani world, in the Modigliani generation, because as themselves maybe they did not receive a lot of inheritance and they didn't see a lot of inheritance around them. So maybe they are still a little bit in this formula. Then indeed, then we can rationalize the view of the world where you tax labor more than inheritance. Okay, and that's the key finding is this. And maybe just to summarize the intuition, I think I already gave the intuition, but let me state it again because I think it captures something interesting, which is that when you have a low BY, when you have a low flow of bequest, which corresponds to a high growth rate, basically, intuitively, then there is not much to gain from taxing bequest. And since this is bad for my own children, you should better not tax bequest too much, because with high growth rate, what matters is the future, basically, not the rentiers of the past. Now, with low growth rate and high inheritance flows, and it's exactly the opposite. It's worth taxing bequest and rentiers so as to reduce labor taxation and to allow people with zero inheritance to leave a bequest. So this is really quite a subtle, a trade-off, and I think this captures some of the ambivalent views that people have with respect to inheritance taxation. Let me just mention that the proposition can be extended to any utility function, any elasticity, so any dynamic process, and basically we keep the same flavor of the tax formula, and that's what we like in this approach, is that the optimal tax formula are very robust to changes in the specification, like in the optimal tax formula I showed you before. And so it's very much a sort of sufficient statistics approach where we only need to get a few parameters from the data to calibrate the formula. And so here, the only extra term that we have is the elasticity effect. So this is the long-run elasticity of the bequest flow with respect to the tax rate. But the important thing is that, of course, with a higher elasticity, you want to tax less, but that's going to be reasonable. It's not going to be this kind of bang-bang conclusion that you have in the infinite horizon model, where once you introduce adverse incentive effect, you go to 0% tax rate, which, again, is pure nonsense. Okay? So here it's going to be reasonable. You can calibrate the formula. You can, from the evidence we have on using changes in inheritance tax rate is that the elasticity is probably fairly small. I will put less than 0.2, but we can at least can have an informed discussion about this, and we can talk about various empirical estimates. That's okay. Let me use a few more minutes just to show you how we can go from inheritance tax to capital tax. So with perfect capital markets, then it's always better just to have a big tax on bequest and zero lifetime tax on capital, so as to avoid intertemporal distortion. Now, in the real world, clearly, as I said before with the property tax example, this doesn't seem to work this way. In the real world, apparently, people prefer to pay a little bit of tax on their assets and on their capital during their entire life rather than only a big tax at the time of inheritance. And if you look in the real world, the bequest tax itself is typically less than 1% of GDP and much less important than the tax you pay on capital during your entire life, either through the form of property tax or corporate income tax, which is a way to pay tax on the flow of dividend coming from your assets, or on direct interest or dividend income tax. So you have a much more tax, what we call lifetime capital tax, than transfer capital tax. And our view is that this choice in favor of lifetime capital tax is perfectly rational once you introduce capital market imperfection. Maybe there is some tax illusion, but we don't need tax illusion to explain this. So let me mention the... of course, there's another reason. Let me also mention very quickly another reason for the lifetime capital tax is, of course, that the frontier between capital income and labor income is fuzzy. It can be manipulated by taxpayers. So if you let's take an extreme example. So very simple proposition. Let's add to the model the assumption that the frontier is completely fuzzy. Okay? So it's just an informational assumption. As a tax administration, you cannot make the difference between capital and labor income. So this is typically what the Merlis review people have in mind, which is at least that for top people, people who have their own firms, their own company, if you tax dividend less than wage, then they would just reduce their wage and increase their dividend. So, you have no choice but having the same rate and having a comprehensive income tax. To a large extent, this is what we push in the Révolution Fiscale. If you make this assumption, then what you get in this model is that well, by assumption, the capital income tax rate and the labor income tax rate will have to be the same, but still, you will put an extra tax on bequest if and only if the bequest flow is sufficiently large. So in other words, the capital tax is not a perfect substitute for the inheritance tax, but it's more should be thought as a complement. So if you are forced to tax capital income at the same rate as labor income, then typically if you have a large flow of inheritance, you will have on the top a tax on bequest, well, which is typically, the old-style optimal tax system which Pierre was talking about, where you have a comprehensive income tax and a bequest tax. And, in our model, this is, clearly under these assumptions, this can be a social optimum. Now, the problem is that if when you introduce this kind of exemptions, you will need actually an even larger bequest tax, which is a problem because in the review, if I understand well, you don't want to increase the bequest tax, or at least this is much less vocal than the proposal and the normal rate of return exemption, which is the main thing, I guess, that people will remember, and where they will put a normal rate of return quite large in practice, from what I can see. But anyway, at least this provides a theoretical framework where we can think about these different options in terms of social welfare maximization, which is good, I think. Now, let me mention very quickly the two different kinds of capital market imperfections, which I think, this fuzziness argument is not quite enough because, sometimes I think the frontier is sort of fuzzy, but it's not completely fuzzy. We can sometimes make the difference between capital income and labor income. Typically, we have property tax, we have wealth tax. We can make the frontier to some extent. So assume away this fuzziness argument and concentrate on the capital market imperfection argument. Okay? There are two kinds of capital market imperfection we model in the paper. One is simply a liquidity problem, which is that when you have to pay 30% of your inheritance right away, maybe you will have to sell the property in order to pay the tax. So if you have borrowing constraint, if on the top of that you have indivisibility problem, typically with a house, of course, this gives you an obvious reason why people prefer to pay 1% during 30 years. And so if you just introduce a little bit of imperfection here, and if you have a low intertemporal elasticity of substitution, then people will prefer the property tax option, basically. The other the second kind of capital market imperfection is uninsurable uncertainty about the future rate of return. And here it's very important. Again, let me give you a simple example, just to convince you that this is not a theoretical issue. Take someone who received inheritance, an apartment in Paris in 1972, 1971, whatever, which is when I was born, that was worth, 50,000 francs at that time. Now, nobody knew at that time that in 2011 it will be worth 4 million euros and it will allow you to save, 5,000 euros per month in rental income. Nobody could possibly guess that in 1972. So it would have been stupid to have a huge tax on inheritance in 1972, and it's indeed much more efficient to have a lower tax rate on inheritance and then to tax the flow income or the evolution of the value of the asset. But the point is that the optimal tax rate in our tax formula really depends not so much on the value of inheritance at the time you receive it, but rather on the capitalized value of inheritance. Because from the point of view of economic benefit and ability to pay tax, what matters is the capitalized value of your inheritance, not so much the inheritance you receive. Now, the only problem is that at the time you receive inheritance, nobody knows the capitalized value of inheritance. And this really gives you a very, very simple reason why you want to put most of the tax burden during the lifetime of the individual. So this is really why I think we need to think about inheritance tax and capital tax jointly. We cannot say, and this is the problem sometimes I have, we cannot say, okay, let's talk about capital income tax and then let's talk about the inheritance tax. I don't think we can do that. We need to look at them jointly. And if we do that, we get this kind of theoretical result, which is basically that if the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is small and the capital market imperfections are large, then, it's not going to be surprising that you have most of the optimal tax burden in the form of lifetime capital tax. So, typically a proposition that we have in the paper is this, which is that depending on the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, you can have optimal capital income tax rate, which are going to be smaller or larger than the labor income tax rate. And typically, in practice, I think we are, maybe my main problem with this Merlis review approach is I think you are putting a lot of weight on an intertemporal distortion, which I think is not very big. The intertemporal elasticity of substitution is certainly positive, it's bigger than 0. But if we do, calibration with, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, or even 0.5 for sigma, which is really the biggest value for which I know micro estimate for the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, then typically you're going to get that the optimal tax rate from a social welfare maximization viewpoint are actually bigger for capitals than for labor income, which is actually what you had in the UK and US until the 70s. And I think the reason why we moved away from that have mostly to do with tax competition between countries and the lack of policy coordination, and have little to do with deep intellectual reason. And I think economists should be very careful about that. I think, sometimes on this issue of capital taxation, I think economists are a bit schizophrenic because they feel they have little influence, that, the powerful forces of tax competition are the most important forces, rather than intellectual forces. And then they try to somehow follow the trend by saying, oh, by the way, we have theoretical reason which also push toward less capital tax. Except that I think these reasons are mostly based on bad theoretical models. So I think we should be very careful. Just I think just be pushing for the trend. I think is bad. So that's my conclusion. The main contribution of this paper is to try to provide simple, or I was not able to show you everything, but you could see that the optimal tax formula are manageable, are reasonably simple, for analyzing optimal tax rate on inheritance and capital income. At a substantial economic level, the main idea, is very close to what Pierre was saying, in a way, and I feel very close to Pierre in a way, which is that the economist emphasis on the intertemporal distortion is excessive. I think this is not the first order issue. I think the important point about the rate of return in the real world is first that it's typically large. Typically it's larger than the growth rate, which has very disturbing long-run consequences. Basically, it means that wealth coming from the past is capitalized faster than growth, and if you don't do anything about that, typically if you don't tax capital and inheritance, unavoidably, the past is sort of eating up the future, and society is dominated by rentiers in the very long run, which I think is, goes in contradiction with our basic meritocratic view of the world. And the other important point about the rate of return is that it's volatile and unpredictable. And, this is the Paris apartment in 1972 example. Nobody knew that the rate of return on this apartment would be so big for the next 30 years. And this is why, you want to tax capital income and also the capital stock on a lifetime basis rather than simply having a big optimal inheritance tax. So this is what we're trying to get at, and sorry for being a bit too long.